Music venue entrepreneur turned behavioral economist, Jordan Birnbaum has leveraged his technical acumen and innate gregariousness to weave a fascinating career trajectory. He served as the owner-operator of a hybrid media and live music venue that hosted premier parties and benefits for clients ranging from Motorola, Dreamworks, T-Mobile, Fox, and Paramount, while booking talent such as the Black Eyed Peas and Paul Van Dyke. Soon thereafter, he opted to continue his educational pursuits at NYU, getting his master's in industrial and organizational psychology. And now he works at ADP as VP and Chief Behavioral Economist, directing the application of behavioral economics into new product development in the human capital management market. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, Jacqueline, I'm delighted to be here. Just want to say I'm such a fan of your work that anytime I get a chance to talk with you, it's always a real treat.
I'm a fan of your work, and I recently learned that you used to oversee this live music venue. Can you tell me what was that like running that? And I think you had about 100 employees.
That's right, 100 employees, and then usually anywhere from 20 to 50 independent contractors. Also known as promoters, people who would go out and bring the crowds. Gosh, the venue, it's almost too big of an experience to articulate what it was like. There were so many different aspects of it. One of the things that I think helps to give it a little bit of context is how I ended up there. Because if you know me, you would think that I'd be more likely to be, like producing Star Trek conventions than to have a big live music venue. And how I arrived at that place in my career was actually almost an accident. I, at the end of 2000, was very inspired by South Park. They had begun as a viral email video and then got signed to Comedy Central. And in many ways, that was the real birth of Comedy Central when they went to the next level. And I thought that that was indicative of something very powerful happening, that content was going to start surfacing up from the internet, and then the things that hit would turn into mainstream media. And so I thought it would be a really interesting time to get into the world of digital media. And because I love media so much, it felt like a really sort of tempting opportunity. And so I sort of jumped in with both feet, which is kind of how I tend to do things in my life. And in the process of starting to build out a business model and a business operation that could potentially thrive in this new media environment, I came across a real problem. Which is, how am I going to pay for any of this stuff? Now, granted, I'd like to have these big images in my head of, nurturing a hit that becomes a global phenomenon. But how do you keep the lights on between here and there? And so I came up with an idea that I would house the whole thing in a live music venue. That we could, by day, have a media company, and then at night we would open up and start selling tickets to shows and selling drinks. And that's how we keep the lights on until a media nugget emerged from that. And that is what led me down the path to actually even be in that position in the first place. And long story short, I ended up with a 20,000 square foot warehouse space on Hollywood Boulevard in California, and turned that into a 2,000 person capacity music club that was capable of hosting all sorts of events. In fact, funny enough, Rock of Ages, the first ever production run of Rock of Ages anywhere in the world, was at that club. And every weekend we would bring in huge DJs. We would do special events with Hollywood studios, corporations. Really had the opportunity to see all sorts of incredible events in Los Angeles. It's a really great event city, as you could imagine. And so even in that regard, getting the club up and running required building out like business models in all of these different genres. So there was like the rock music strategy, and then the electronic dance music strategy, and then the special events strategy, really to sort of build up the business that was going to give us the kind of cash flow that we would need to start making media.
And what a thrilling experience it sounds like. So then a few years later, you went back and you got your master's degree at NYU. Was it in organizational behavior?
Industrial and organizational psychology.
There we go. So what made you decide to do that? I would not necessarily see your career going in that direction after running this venue.
So it's interesting, and maybe it even plays into the theme here, which is that my job before the venue was running sales for an internet company. And I had an experience at the club when I was training my security guards. And in doing it, I had a flashback to what it used to be like to train salespeople. And what I remember thinking while training the security guards was, gosh, if I think about these different experiences, in both cases, I'm really just trying to do one thing, which is I'm trying to get them to care. So I remember that really felt like an epiphany when I realized that. And I think it made leading easier after that, once I had that sort of realization of what it was that I was really just trying to do. And sometime thereafter, I always been a rabid reader. And so I eventually came across some article that talked about the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Now, intrinsic motivation is doing something because you want to, whereas extrinsic motivation is doing something either for a reward or to ignore a punishment. So, it's like the carrot and stick kind of idea. In corporate America, you're working for your salary, you're working for a bonus in terms of your rewards, and you're working not to get fired in terms of a punishment. And so that's the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And not surprisingly, intrinsic is way more powerful. And so what I think the best bosses in the world instinctively know how to do is to try to tap into intrinsic motivation at work. How can I create an environment whereby you're doing this because you want to, not because you have to, because that's always going to get you the best results. And I was fascinated to learn that there was a science to this. I think I probably had some awareness that there was a study of this stuff, but it just became much more tangible to me in reading this article, and I was hooked. And so I eventually sold the venue in 2010, and then went on to look at a couple of other startups that I was playing with. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And it led me to learn a little bit more about industrial and organizational psychology. And I said, God, I really want to learn this stuff. And so at a ripe old age, I went back to school after, a lot of experience in the workforce. And it was a very different kind of experience going back to school with so much life experience under my belt. But it was wonderful. And I will say this, talk about the power of intrinsic motivation. I was there because I wanted to be there. And so I really took advantage of it. And I think it was way more impactful for me than if I had done it in my 20s.
So when you're talking about these intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, that seems like it would really come into play considering your current role at ADP as, is it VP of Behavioral Economist? But by the way, I've never heard of that position before meeting you.
It is a VP and Chief Behavioral Economist.
There we go.
So here's another interesting piece of the puzzle. My undergrad, I went to Cornell and I studied policy analysis, which is just really heavily based in classical economics and political science. And when I then studied industrial and organizational psychology, Well, it turns out there's this new field that has emerged over the last several years, which is the marriage of economics and psychology. And it's called behavioral economics. And it turns out that this was the curriculum that I had created, 20 years later, by combining these sort of two subjects. And ultimately, what I would say about the relationship between behavioral economics and industrial and organizational psychology is it's like the old saying about cops and detectives. So everything in industrial and organizational psychology is behavioral economics, but not everything in behavioral economics is industrial and organizational psychology, just like every detective is a cop, but not every cop is a detective. So ultimately, it was learning about sort of these fundamental principles and then getting really creative with understanding how you might be able to apply these insights into human behavior to stage mini interventions, often called nudges, that have really significant outcomes on human behavior. And so it really was the confluence of a lot of both academic and then life experience all coming together that made behavioral economics kind of fall into my lap. And so ultimately, when
now, before you go on,
Sorry,
can you give me an example of a behavior and a nudge?
Oh, sure. Okay, so let me start off when just by defining behavioral economics. Here's a really easy example to understand. A doctor can say to you that you have a disease with a 90% survival rate or a 10% mortality rate. That's called framing. And even though that is the exact same thing, people have very different reactions to hearing one of those two sentences. And that's a demonstration of sort of inherent human irrationality. Irrationality doesn't mean stupid, but it just means that the human brain does not always follow the dictums of logic. Because if we did, we would have the same reaction to hearing the statement 10% mortality rate as we have to 90% survival rate. And so it just sort of gives you a sense of, all right, where are human beings maybe getting off track a little bit based on the experience of being human and having one of these human brains? How can you anticipate that? And then stage little interventions to help people overcome that, what will ultimately prove to be like a lapse in judgment. And so probably the most famous example of a nudge, of a mini intervention that addresses that sort of human irrationality, is the default option. And so where most people are familiar with this is that, in many of our lifetimes, although I guess the younger you are, the less likely you are to have experienced this, you might remember 401k participation as being something that you used to have to say, yes, I want to participate. And you had to check a box to say, yes, I want to do this. And that was called opt-in. And then somewhere along the way, they switched it to opt-out. So now when it was time to sign up for 401k, it was, no, I don't want to do this. So I'm checking this box. If, however, I do nothing, then I'm going to be participating in 401k. And not surprisingly, 401k participation shot through the roof like a rocket ship.
Jordan, I've had the opportunity to talk with you on several occasions, and I always feel inspired and motivated when I walk away from these discussions. What is the best way for viewers to follow your work?
Mainly on LinkedIn. I used to be a rabid Twitter sharer as well, but at some point I realized like there were only so many hours in a day. So I'm generally posting on LinkedIn, and of course I will write the periodic byline and various trade magazines and the like, just like my friend Jacqueline, whose work is amazing. And so it's nice to know that we have a mutual fan club going.
Absolutely. Jordan, always a pleasure. Looking forward to next time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please click like below and also subscribe to see future episodes.